Hello and welcome to Bristol. And by way of an introduction, a grindingly steep zigzag path climbing out of the Avon Gorge up to the suburb of Clifton. I'm on my way to an icon not just of Bristol, but an icon to all those great, breathtakingly bold, brilliant engineers that ushered in the railway age, the bridge age, the ship age. I'm on my way to an icon that just says it all. And here it is. Needs no introduction really. This isn't about Kingdom Brunel's Clifton Suspension Bridge. A single span 250 foot above the River Avon, stretching for probably around 1300 feet. Absolutely breathtaking for its age. An absolutely amazing achievement, not only for the age of the designer, but also for the time when most bridges were made of rock or some form of local material, made of stone, some form of local material, where they were fairly low, always had piers or made of arches. To think of throwing a bridge, a suspension bridge, 1,000 foot over the Avon Gorge, 250 feet up in the air, is just absolutely breathtaking. And as we come towards the Clifton end, we just find a plaque that records the erection of this bridge and the laying down of the first footstone. One last look at the Avon Gorge, and it's now time to descend back down the zigzag path and make our way into Bristol and talk about Bristol as a port and talk about the floating harbour. One final thing, of course, when we talk about the Avon Gorge, it is quite unique in many ways. It's home to a number of plants that are totally endemic to the gorge. They grow nowhere else in the world. And on top of that, of course, Bristol's quite famous for the Bristol whitebeam, which only grows in the Avon Gorge and on the Clifton Downs. And a row of just some of the native plants to be found here. And here we have a plaque commemorating the centenary of the great man's death. And having successfully negotiated the descent of the zigzag path, which was quite hazardous, one last look back at the most beautiful bridge. There's very few structures in the world that I would get emotional about, but this is one of them. And fairly soon on, we're going to see another one. By the turn of the 19th century, Bristol was beginning to have a problem. As the country's second busiest port, it was attracting more and more bigger and heavier shipping. However, because it flows into the Bristol Channel, which has the second highest tide in the world, once moored up, this shipping would find itself beached by the outgoing tide. And unless it was particularly well stowed, unless it was particularly well built, it would suffer structural damage. So therefore it had to be what was called ship shape and Bristol fashion. But they needed a long-term answer, and they turned to a brilliant engineer called William Jessup, who between 1800 and 1809 created the floating harbour. He basically dammed two ends of the River Avon, trapping water in it. Then he reconstructed the River Avon to flow around it, which is the so-called New Cut. Then he had to, of course, find ways of manipulating the huge lock gates, so he had to use hydraulics. He did all of this without computers, without pocket calculators, without anything. All built with bricks and shovels, all by hand. No jackhammers, no diggers, no mechanical tools whatsoever. A brilliant feat of engineering that meant that from now on ships could flow to Bristol Harbour and they would stay afloat. Why it's called the Floating Harbour. Huge lock gates, absolutely huge. The lock gates we are standing on are not the original, designed by Jessup. By the 1840s, even Jessup's Floating Harbour had become too small for the ships of the day. So they commissioned Brunel to enlarge the floating harbour, and he provided for what's now called the Cumberland Basin, which we're going to come to. And these are the new lock gates leading into the Cumberland Basin. And as we walk down, we will see the swing bridge, the new swing bridge, that metal blue thing with cars going over it in front. That was actually built around 1960. But before then, we had, for any traffic wanting to cross these lock gates in the Cumberland Basin, we had Bob. And as we approach this new swing bridge, you see to the left what looks like a piece of junk old metal. That's Bob, known as Brunel's other bridge. It was a swing bridge designed to swing over across the lock and the entrance into the Cumberland Harbour, and that was the bridge in use for about 100 years. It's a swivel bridge, but what really marks it out is the construction, which is mostly tubular wrought iron. And you could see this as the forerunner to one of his greatest ever constructions, which was the Saltash Railway Bridge, carrying the broad gauge of the Great Western Railway down to Penzance. It is almost as though it is a miniature scale model, but very much a miniature, and of course designed to carry people and occasional cart traffic, and not thundering great steam locomotives. And as we continue our walk now into Bristol, walking along the Cumberland Basin, start to get a feel of what a most attractive place this is. Really, really attractive. That, of course, is despite the efforts of Bristol planners who in the late 1970s and 80s wanted to destroy this place. But as I'm having a happy day, I'll leave that rant for another time. This is the Underfall Yard, and in front of us we have the powerhouse that since the 1860s used steam to drive the hydraulics that open and close the lock gates. Some of those lock gates 2-3 miles away. Once derelict, due for sort of the usual sort of grey housing plots, etc., it's been transformed into a yard full of little artisan workshops, making bits for ships, making ships, repairing ships, and doing lots of other stuff. Most attractive, it's got a coffee shop and a little visitor centre and plaques that tell you what it's all about. But as it's 7 o'clock at night, most of that is closed, so I'll get a move on and get past this onto Baltic Wharf. And this is now the quite attractive area of Baltic Wharf. Well, I find it attractive because just behind me is the Caravan Club campsite, which is where I've got my camper parked. But quite an attractive little place. This used to be all the timber wharves, and that's why it's called Baltic Wharf. Timber that's come from the Baltic countries and quite a lot from Canada, and closed it in the late 60s. Like most of these docks, it was a complete and absolute mess. The place looked a shambles. But now quite an attractive place to be, and fairly soon we arrive at Bristol Marina, where now small ships dock, a dock in for repair or a dock just to overnight or a harbour. And as we come round the marina in the background, you see the tall masts of yet another ship. Well, I did say when we left the suspension bridge that there's one other structure in Bristol that I can get very emotional about. And well, this is it. This is the SS Great Britain. And at this point I can talk for hours, so I might as well give you a health warning to go and put on the kettle, make a nice cup of tea, get a nice comfy armchair ready, and sort of read a book or something until I have finished. But the SS Great Britain is really the most attractive, beautiful ship. She was the second of Brunel's great ships. The first one, the SS Great Western, had been a roaring success. It was a wooden-built paddle steamer, the very first ship in the world to offer a scheduled service between Europe and the United States crossing the Atlantic. It was the biggest ship of its day, and the Great Western Steamship Company had always agreed that there would be a second and then a third ship. Brunel spent 2 years designing the second ship. The accountants were all happy with the cost of it, etc. Went into Bristol harbour, sailed another ship called the Sirius. The Sirius was quite a small ship, but she was quite revolutionary. Her hull was built of iron. After a few trials with the Sirius, Brunel decided that he would like the SS Great Britain to be built of iron. It would solve a number of problems. Firstly, it could be a lot bigger, because wooden ships suffered from a problem called hogging, which is where the keel tends to buckle and lift upwards in very big seas after a ship's been built of a certain length. He actually prevented that from happening in the SS Great Britain by laying 2 huge girders right the length of her keel, which is how she managed to survive the rough treatment she was to have later. After a lot of arguments with the directors and probably mass suicide amongst the accountants of the Great Western Steamship Company, they agreed to make it of iron and massively increase its build, its size. So off they went again, plan 2. When into Bristol harbour came a ship called the Archimedes, and the Archimedes was driven by a screw propeller. And you guessed it, another set of accountants jumping out of the window. Brunel had one hell of a fight to get his idea adopted, but it was then agreed that the SS Great Britain would be powered by a screw propeller. And never in history had a screw propeller propelled such a huge ship, and it's a testimony to Brunel's engineering genius that the propeller he eventually designed was within 5% efficiency of what drives big ships today. No computers, no pocket calculators, just his brain. A quick summary of her career. When she was launched in 1843 by Prince Albert, she was the largest ship afloat, 1/3 bigger by weight than the nearest big ship before her. She had a couple of almost fateful incidents at the beginning. Went on to become an Atlantic liner, then a troop ship for the Crimean War. Then she was sold to Gibson's son, and for the next 20 years she carried over 16,000 people to Australia, fueling the Australian gold rush. She was then converted to a cargo ship and served that role well until in the early 1900s she suffered a further accident and she was beached in the Falklands. Eventually she was towed around to Sparrow Cove in the Falklands, beached against some rocks and left to rot. She was used as a dry storage for wool. Holes were punched in her hull to allow drainage. Her back was almost broken by a crack that went up both sides of her hull, and she just lay there, rotting away. Her rescue was almost as dramatic and as brave and as bold as her build. Brunel would have been proud of her rescue. It started with Dr. Ewan Corlett sending a letter to the Times in 1968 suggesting that this old girl be brought home. The feat of bringing her home was almost impossible. It was a feat that Brunel himself would have been so proud of. There was no money until Sir Jack Hayward, the billionaire steel magnate, put forward £500,000 to finance her recovery. She had to be packed with mattresses scrounged from everywhere to stop her broken hull breaking in two and the ship just flooding and going down. She could not be brought back under her own flotation. She had to be gently placed upon a pontoon that was then towed for 8,000 miles across some of the most storm-tossed waters in the world, across the South and North Atlantics, to finally arrive home at Bristol. Finally brought back. When we look at we're looking now at the weather deck and some of the restored cabins on the weather deck, and compare her now to what she was in 1970, when the old girl finally came home to the very dock where she was built. Welcome home. Welcome home, you beautiful old girl. We're going to walk through into the first class salon. Every part of this ship has been beautifully restored according to the original drawings of 1843 onwards. The fact that those drawings still exist is a testament to the Brunel family, who meticulously kept all his papers, which were eventually bequeathed by Lady Celia Brunel Noble to Bristol University in 1964, and are now under the safekeeping of the Brunel Institute in this very dockyard. The ship was restored by the SS Great Britain Trust, a charity. There was no government funding. Bristol City Council was uninterested. It had grandiose plans for this area anyway, which I'll come to when I get to my much wanted rant. The trust bounced off the walls of bankruptcy so often until finally some big sponsors came in, big industrial sponsors, and one must also mention the National Lottery. I just feel privileged beyond belief to be able to say that I am a life member of the SS Great Britain Trust. These are replicas of the original steam engines that powered the ship. The original steam engines have long been used for scrap. Anyway, I'm going to leave this ship now. I can talk for hours, I can show you around for hours, but that's not what I'm here for. And I'm going to leave this ship before I burst into tears anyway, because it always leaves me very, very emotional. This was the heroic age. This was when Britain didn't just lead the world. This was when Britain actually showed the world what can be done. And we can still do it. Just a few miles up the road from here was where the first British Concorde flew from. Just up the road from here is where Bloodhound 2 project is. That holds the world speed record with thrust 3 and is now looking at making that speed record go even further with a rocket powered. Yes, we can do it. We have the expertise. We have the heritage of people like Brunel, Stevenson, Locke, Vignals, Telford. I can go on forever. Let's never ever lose confidence that we can do it. Anyway, I'm off now. I'm going to show you something that's quite exciting. That's just a new development. This is the Albion Dockyard. It's just at the back of the SS Great Britain Trust dockyard. And the SS Great Britain Trust have now acquired the rear part of this. And it's going to build a replica of Brunel's first ever ship, the Great Western. We now have the space, we now have the funding, and we now have the willpower. And what a brilliant companion it will be to the old girl just around the corner to have a replica of the very first ship to run a scheduled service across the Atlantic. Fantastic. Probably the most exciting thing that's happened to this dockyard since they brought the old girl back home. And talking of replicas, this is a replica of the Matthew, the ship that John Cabot sailed over to discover the American continent in 1497. just a few years after Columbus sailed over and named the place America, although he only got as far as Hispaniola. With great imagination, John Cabot called the place he found Newfoundland. Well, Newfoundland, and look at the size of that. Look at the tiny little ship she is to sail across that great ocean. Well, before we get to Redcliffe and the end of this walk, we get to the M Shed, which houses a museum of Bristol life. It also houses a reminder, a rather gruesome reminder, that in 1694 the monopoly held by the London Africa Company in the slave trade was broken, and two ports in particular in England joined in that slave trade with a great relish. One was Bristol and one was Liverpool. It was estimated by 1735 that 30% of Bristol's income was derived from the slave trade, either transporting or owning. We can't change history. I can't apologise for what my ancestors did. I can learn from it. And every time I come to places like this that has a section devoted to that vile, inhuman, disgusting trade, I learn more. I learn more about even how inhuman it was, how the people who traded in it must have sold their souls, how they must have lost all sight of humanity. And we must remember also that when we abolished slavery, and we certainly did, and Bristol was one of the towns where people like John Wesley campaigned so hard for the abolition. When we abolished slavery, we compensated those slave owners handsomely. At the time, the debt was £20 million that we borrowed to pay them off. That was 5% of our GDP. I can't even start to imagine how much that would be today. And not one single penny went towards compensation for the slaves themselves. I always get horrified when I come to little exhibitions like this. I learn more, I understand more. As I say, I can't change history. I can't be responsible for what my ancestors did. I can learn. I can pass that learning on. When we congratulate ourselves, what an advanced country we are. When we look at our advanced infrastructure, when we rightly talk about our great engineers, let us also remember the blood money that paid for it, the blood money of slavery. Well, that's my statement. Over, onwards and upwards, and let's get to the place of pirates and privateers known as Redcliffe. The area known as Redcliffe, so called because of the red cliffs, of red sandstone cliffs used to adorn it, was a home of pubs, pirates and privateers. This is where the crews got off their ships and went and found their amusement. And there's some very, very interesting pubs, and also what Elizabeth I called the fairest, most goodliest church in England, which you can just see the spire of in front. Redcliffe is famous for its caves, a network or an absolute warren of tunnels underneath the streets. Although they're not caves, they are actual quarry tunnels. It was found that the sand that composed the Red Cliff, the sand was absolutely perfect for glass making, and therefore it was quarried and used for what became the famous Bristol glass, Bristol blue glass. And you can still see signs of that sand today, typically in one pub which is actually burrowed into it. And just over the river you can see the ostrich. And we just pop in. They're not open, but never mind. I just have to use my charm to try and persuade them to open this door, let us in, and let us have a look at the small cavity that shows the way into Redcliffe Caves. If I can. And I can. Here we go. And just round the corner from the Ostrich is Guinea Street. This is supposed to be the birthplace of a man called Edward Teach, who, after a rather illustrious career involving mutiny, etc., became the most famous pirate, known as Blackbeard. And naturally there has to be a pub in his memory. The Golden Guinea. Yes, blood, the Blackbeard Buccaneers. And there's a picture of him up on the pub sign in a moment. And whilst we're now having a pub crawl, we've just popped around the corner to another pub, the Hole in the Wall. So named because of this little extension at the back that has 2 holes in its walls. We're sat lookouts, looking either for press gangs or soldiers coming to arrest pirates. Well, I'm now going to walk back to Baltic Wharf, to where my camper is parked. I hope you've enjoyed this video. Oh yes, the rant I promised you. Let's finish with a good old rant. And it's not so much a rant, it's a prayer. It's a prayer that never again from this day onwards would city planners put the motor car before people, history, heritage. Back in the 1970s, when the old girl was being brought back from the Falklands and Bristol City Council didn't want to do really very much towards helping, they had a plan of their own. A great big grandiose plan. They were going to extend the M32 as a great big urban motorway right around Bristol. And you don't have to be a rocket science to see that Bristol's built on loads of hills, so this great big monolith, ugly concrete structure would have to be on stilts. And where were they going to put the interchange? Oh yes, right where the M Shed is, between the M Shed and the SS Great Britain, where the Matthew is, where the glorious views of Clifton are, where those lovely little low-rise houses are. They were going to turn that into a great big concrete monolith. One of the things they said is, we can't have a light railway. There's no railway, there's no provision for it. Can somebody tell me what this wharf is called? This wharf built in the 1800s. What this is called? Yes, it's Railway Wharf. Guess what? We could have done it. But no, fortunately, they didn't get away with it. They're even going to fill the harbour in, for goodness sake, to make more land. But no, they didn't get away with it. The Secretary of State wouldn't allow it. They didn't have the money. And the protest movement became so loud that they just couldn't ignore it anymore. But please, never again. Keep the history, keep the heritage, keep the recreation, provide for more housing, and provide for a decent urban transport network, so that the car does not need to even exist in the inner city. Thank you and goodbye. I hope you've enjoyed this. Nice to finish on a rant for once. I hope you've enjoyed this, and happy walking.